Roman mosaics and white marble statues depict harmony and ideals of beauty, but behind their cold smoothness lay a life in which women rarely belonged to themselves. Marriage in ancient Rome was rarely a union of love. More often, it was a contract in which the wife's body became the property of her husband. And in this contract, passion gave way to control, humiliation, and systematic abuse, which ancient chronicles mention dryly, as if they were talking about household utensils. In a society where men were considered the lawmakers of morality and the guardians of family honor, women became objects on which power was enforced with iron and pain. Sources mention special iron rings that husbands could put on their wives' chests, not as jewelry, but as a mark of restraint and mutilation. Such devices are described in treatises on the punishment and medical observations. The rings squeezed the tissue, impeded blood circulation, and caused inflammation and constant pain. A woman's body became a reminder of her husband's power. Every breath was restricted by metal. Every night was torture. It is important to remember that Rome was not monolithic. It changed from the Republic to the Empire, from Sulla to Augustus and Nero. But the system of control over wives remained unchanged. Women could formally participate in banquets or religious ceremonies, but their freedom was determined by the boundaries set by their husbands. In the legal texts of the time, especially in the 12 Tables, marriage was seen as a transfer of power to the husband, manus. This term literally meant hand, symbolizing that the wife's entire life belonged to another. Sexual relations in marriage were often akin to violence under the guise of law. A man did not have to ask for consent. It was considered to be inherent in the very fact of marriage. Custom allowed a husband not only to demand intimacy, but also to accompany it with threats or physical punishment. The Roman moralist Cato the Elder stated bluntly in his speeches, "If a husband beats his wife, he is acting according to the law." This was not an isolated case, but a reflection of a culture in which suffocation by passion and pain was considered an acceptable part of married life. It is difficult for modern people to imagine, but ancient sources contain descriptions of how some husbands used sexual torture to tame their wives. Plutarch and Suetonius mention scenes in which emperors or noble patricians allowed themselves to publicly humiliate women, forcing them to perform intimate acts in front of servants or guests. For a Roman, this was not so much an expression of desire as an act of power, a demonstration that his wife was a possession. The medicine of the time recorded the consequences of such treatment. In the works of doctors such as Celsus and Galen, one can find descriptions of damage to the breasts and uterus caused by mechanical impact or excessive sexual coercion. Doctors noted inflammation, tissue tears, and severe bleeding. But their records lack moral judgment. The wife's body was described as dispassionately as that of a slave or a warrior patient after battle. Women who were subjected to such upbringing were deprived of their right to vote. Forms of divorce existed in Rome, but they were controlled by the husband and his family. If the husband decided that his wife was unclean or disobedient, she could be sent into exile or back to her father's house. At the same time, the woman herself almost never had the right to break the union. Sexual abuse and torture were not considered grounds for complaint. They were part of the accepted order. One more thing to keep in mind is religious justification. The cult of household gods, the Lares and Penates, linked family honor to the wife's body. If a woman resisted her husband, it was seen as a violation of harmony and even an insult to the gods. So pain and submission became a religious duty. The very structure of the Roman house, the domus, was designed to keep the wife under constant supervision. Separate women's quarters, control by servants, and limited access to the city. Sexual torture sometimes took the form of a ritual. Historians record cases where husbands forced their wives to participate in acts that humiliated their bodies and minds during holidays or orgies. This could include violent acts using objects, shackling, and prolonged restraint in humiliating positions. For guests, such scenes served as entertainment, while for the wife, they were further proof that her body did not belong to her. All this existed against the backdrop of a paradoxical public morality. In Rome, people like to talk about the dignity of the matron and the purity of the wife as a symbol of the family and the state. But behind this word lay methods that today would be considered torture. Iron rings on the chest, suffocation during sex, and control through humiliation, with a reality hidden behind the facade of marble temples and forums. Contemporaries perceived this differently. For them, a wife was a continuation of the family line, a vessel for heirs, an object for demonstrating power. Even in literature, from Ovid's poems to Martial's bawdy stories, this idea shines through. A woman is either an object of passion or an object of punishment. And in both cases, her pain was irrelevant. The dry figures of ancient population censuses only emphasize the scale. In large houses, where dozens of slaves and servants lived, the master's wife lived in conditions of no less dependence than the slaves. Formerly, she could have had the status of a citizen, wear rich clothes, and visit the baths. But within the family, her position could be more humiliating than that of a slave, because the torture she was subjected to was considered legal and normal. It was slavery disguised as marriage. Roman love rarely had anything to do with passion or mutual affection. It was a contract in which the female body became an arena for demonstrating strength and power. And every iron hoop, every night of pain, served as a reminder that behind the marble columns of the Roman Empire lay a cruel and grim reality. The problem of humiliation and pain in Roman marriage was particularly evident in the late Republic, when power and morals became increasingly brutal. Historians note that against a backdrop of constant wars and political crises, men transferred the model of discipline and violence from the army to the family. Soldiers, accustomed to breaking the bodies of their enemies, returned home and treated their wives and concubines as they would prisoners of war. This reinforced the idea in society that the female body was a territory to be subjugated. Legal practice confirmed this system. Women had no independent property. Everything they brought into the marriage, from their dowry to their clothes, became the property of their husbands. And if he decided to punish his wife, her body became as much his property as his house or land. Legal texts contain discussions of acceptable measures of influence, which, along with restrictions on freedom and beatings, included methods of physical restraint. Iron rings, handcuffs, and belts could be used as instruments of control and as symbols of punishment for disobedience. Sexual practices often turned into tests of pain. There is evidence that some husbands squeezed their wives' breasts with iron clamps, causing soft tissue trauma, bruising, and suppuration. Doctors wrote about cases where women lost sensitivity or suffered from chronic inflammation. For Roman medicine, such injuries were a side effect of excessive passion, but behind this wording lay systematic abuse. The cultural background must also be taken into account. In Rome, there was a tradition of public spectacles where pain and death were part of the entertainment. When citizens saw gladiators being torn apart in the arena or slaves being executed for disobedience, it formed a habit of perceiving suffering as normal. Therefore, even within the family, abuse of one's wife did not seem unnatural. Moreover, the higher a man's social status, the more harshly he could treat his wife, demonstrating his power in front of servants and guests. The era of Julius Caesar and subsequent dictators brought new forms of demonstrative humiliation. Political life was rife with scandals involving wives and mistresses. Chronicles mention cases where wives were accused of adultery and punished by public humiliation. They were stripped naked in front of a crowd, chained, and forced to participate in humiliating processions. Although this was a political tool, the same thing happened in private life, but without witnesses. Sexual violence in marriage was seen as an inalienable right of the husband. It was considered acceptable not only to demand intimacy at any time, but also to accompany the act with beatings or other disciplinary methods. Historians note that in some cases, men used torture to arouse or punish their wives. They held them down by force, tied them up, and used objects that caused pain. The writings of Suetonius and Tacitus mention such practices among the nobility, although they were presented as gossip about the debauchery of the emperors. However, even these rumors show that such behavior was part of everyday reality. The medical consequences were severe. Modern reconstructions based on Galen's texts suggest that women often suffered from chronic infections caused by mechanical trauma and a lack of basic hygiene. The iron that compressed the breasts left wounds that healed poorly. In ancient times, this led to abscesses, fever, and in severe cases, sepsis and death. However, such cases were rarely recorded as victims of violence. Officially, they were considered natural diseases. The practice of sexual punishment during feasts held a special place. The Roman elite loved to throw feasts where wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere quickly turned into a bacchanalia. Wives could be forced to participate in such scenes against their will, performing roles that humiliated them. Servants and guests became witnesses and sometimes participants. For the husband, this was a demonstration that his power was absolute, and that his wife was merely part of his property, like furniture or wine vessels. The psychological consequences for women remain beyond the scope of ancient texts, but one can imagine that constant humiliation and pain created a state of depression, fear, and dependence. Women lived in a world where resistance meant even harsher punishment. It is known that many Roman wives attempted suicide. Tacitus and Valerius Maximus wrote about cases of suicide among noble women, explaining it as preserving honor. But behind this wording probably lay attempts to escape abuse that seemed endless. Thus, Roman marriage, which is often presented in textbooks as a union between two families, often turned into an arena of torture in reality. Women found themselves caught between the rights of their husbands, the indifference of society, and the silence of medicine. The iron rings on their chests were not just a symbol of punishment, they became a sign of an entire system, where love was equal to submission and intimacy was equal to pain. With the advent of the empire, the abuse of wives took on even more sophisticated forms. The power of the emperors created an atmosphere of permissiveness. If the first man in the state could publicly humiliate and maim women, then the subjects perceived this as the norm. The court became a mirror of society, where marriage and sexual intimacy turned into an arena of violence. Historians Suetonius and Tacitus left plenty of evidence of how emperors used their wives and mistresses to demonstrate their power. Caligula, whom his contemporaries called insane, openly staged scenes of humiliation of women's honor. He forced noble matrons to spread their clothes at banquets and subjected them to inspection in front of senators, as if they were slaves at a market. For him, it was a way of showing that even the most high-born women were nothing before his power. Those who dared to object risked not only their own lives, but also the lives of their children. Nero went even further. His relationships with his wives, Sabina Poppaea and Octavia, went down in history as examples of cruelty. He kicked Poppaea, who was pregnant, in the stomach. According to Tacitus, she died from her injuries along with her child. In Octavia's case, the abuse was systematic. She was accused of debauchery, chained up, and publicly humiliated. Chronicles report that she was exiled to the island of Pandateria, where she was tortured with cold and starvation. But even there, the abuse did not stop. Her body was used as an object of humiliation until her execution. Domitian, emperor at the end of the 1st century AD, had a habit of torturing women in intimate ways. Suetonius describes how, during nightly orgies, he would tie up the wives of senators and force them to perform acts accompanied by pain. He was called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and in the eyes of his courtiers, his cruel games were not crimes, but manifestations of divine will. But it is important to remember that these were not exceptions, but the tip of the iceberg. If the emperor allowed himself such behavior, it meant that thousands of ordinary Romans in the provinces were repeating the same patterns in their families. Where there is no control or punishment, sadism becomes part of the norm. Medical texts from that era provide grim confirmation. Galen's writings describe internal injuries in women, uterine ruptures, severe bleeding, chronic chest pain. All of this was attributed to either difficult childbirth or excessive male passions. But behind this formula lay torture. Iron rings on the chest continued to be used. Archaeologists have found metal clamps in burials next to female skeletons, and although their purpose has long been interpreted as decorative, more and more researchers are inclined to believe that they were instruments of oppression. Scenes of violence sometimes became public. Hundreds of guests attended imperial banquets, and a wife could find herself exposed to the crowd just like a slave. Plutarch wrote that during Nero's reign, the female body became an arena for entertainment. Women were forced to submit to games that included strangulation, squeezing of the breasts with iron, and coercion into acts with multiple partners under threat of punishment. For the wife of a patrician or senator, this meant that her life was no safer than that of a slave. Status did not protect her from pain. On the contrary, it made her more vulnerable, as her body became a hostage to politics. If a husband wanted to strengthen his position at court, he could sacrifice his wife by giving her to the emperor or his associates. The chronicles mention cases where women were handed over for night games as a pledge of loyalty. The physiological consequences of this violence were devastating. Women were often unable to bear children. Uterine trauma and chronic inflammation made pregnancy life-threatening. Archaeological data confirm a high mortality rate among women between the ages of 20 and 30. Burials from this period contain remains showing signs of trauma, broken ribs, traces of bone infections caused by chronic inflammatory processes. We can only reconstruct the psychological consequences, but it is known that many women of the imperial nobility ended their lives by suicide. Tacitus describes a case where a noble Roman woman, unable to bear the humiliation, cut her veins in a bathhouse. This was not uncommon, but rather an expected outcome. A life of constant sexual torture and public humiliation left only two options: submission or death. And yet, the system continued to exist because society considered it natural. Because in Rome, a woman, even the emperor's wife, was first and foremost a body that could be used, maimed, and broken without breaking the law. And because the very structure of power demanded that pain and submission become the norm, and love remained just a word hiding a cruel reality. If cruelty took the form of spectacle in the imperial palaces, in the provinces, it became part of everyday life. Millions of Romans did not live in marble villas, but in simple houses made of stone and clay, where the walls were too thin to hide screams. There, marriage also remained an instrument of subjugation, and the abuse of wives was a common occurrence that almost no one considered a crime. In the families of ordinary citizens, cruelty was not manifested through the sophisticated sadistic games of the emperors, but through systematic violence justified by tradition. A husband would return from the army or the market, and if his wife seemed disobedient or lazy, she could be beaten with a belt or stick, deprived of food, or locked in a separate room. Sometimes the same iron clamps or rough leather belts were used to squeeze the chest or stomach. These instruments were not only available to the nobility, blacksmiths and craftsmen made them to order, and archaeological finds in the provinces include simple iron rings that were clearly not intended for decoration. Local priests and magistrates did not intervene. The law was on the side of the husband. Provincial codes mention that a man has the right to bring his wife to her senses, and if he kills her in the process, it is not considered murder, but a permissible measure. Thus, the system itself encouraged the transformation of marriage into a place of torture. For women from poor families, the situation was exacerbated by the lack of medical care. While in Rome, there were at least doctors who could diagnose inflammation and trauma, in the provinces, care was limited to midwives and healers. Midwives faced the horrific consequences of abuse: mutilated breasts, vaginal tears, chronic bleeding. But they could not change anything. At most, they tried to stop the bleeding or applied herbs to relieve the pain. The social structure reinforced this system. Men were citizens, warriors, and taxpayers. Women were merely the continuation of their lineage. Even children were raised to accept violence as normal. Sons watched their fathers punish their mothers and saw this as a model of male behavior. Daughters saw their mothers suffering and understood that the same fate awaited them. This is how a culture was perpetuated in which the female body existed only as an object of power. Archaeology provides grim confirmation. In excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum, inscriptions were found on walls, where men boasted about how they tamed their wives. Some graves contained the skeletons of women with signs of chronic trauma, broken ribs and traces of pelvic deformities caused by mechanical impact. These injuries were not related to war. They indicate systematic and severe domestic violence. The religious context only reinforced this system. In local temples, household gods were considered guardians of family honor. If a wife disobeyed her husband, it was interpreted as a threat to the entire family, even as an insult to the gods. Therefore, the husband had the sacred right to take any measures necessary to restore order. Thus, abuse of wives was perceived not as a personal whim, but as a religious duty. The conditions of provincial life gave rise to particular cruelty. Where war and raids were part of everyday life, men accustomed to bloodshed carried the same logic into the home. Captured women could be turned into concubines, and wives became objects for demonstrating superiority. Husbands often staged public punishments in front of neighbors or servants to show who was boss. For the wife, this was a double humiliation. The physical pain was accompanied by shame that could not be hidden. The medical consequences in the provinces were even more devastating. The high mortality rate among women aged 25-30 was due not only to difficult childbirth, but also to chronic injuries sustained in their youth. Girls who were married off very early, sometimes at the age of 12 to 14, and their immature bodies became targets for violence. Squeezing the breasts with iron or belts led to deformation, disruption of the development of the mammary glands, and inflammation of the lungs. Constant blows to the abdomen caused internal bleeding, but none of this was considered a problem. A woman could always be replaced by another. In rare cases, written evidence of resistance has survived. In letters from the Egyptian provinces that have come down to us on papyrus, there are complaints from women about husbands who treat them worse than slaves. But these letters were addressed to relatives and had no legal force. They show only despair. Women knew that no one would protect them. Thus, the life of a provincial Roman woman differed little from that of a slave. Even if she was a freeborn citizen, her body remained under her husband's control, and abuse was considered a natural part of marriage. This was slavery within the family, hidden behind a facade of tradition and religion. In late antiquity, when the Roman Empire gradually weakened under the pressure of internal crises and external enemies, the abuse of wives did not disappear, but only transformed. The laws were softened on paper, but the practice remained the same. Even when Christianity became the dominant religion and sermons began to speak of mercy and the equality of souls before God, in reality, women's bodies continued to be perceived as the property of men. Christian authors such as Tertullian and Augustine called for moderation and marriage in the name of honor and chastity, but their texts also retain the same logic of control. A wife must obey her husband as the church obeys Christ. This formula legitimized women's subordination, but now a religious element was added. Obedience was seen as a virtue and resistance as a sin. Thus, what had previously been justified by Roman law was now reinforced by religion. Archaeological data from the late period show that iron rings and clamps continued to be used until the 4th to 5th centuries AD. They were found not only in wealthy Roman homes, but also in rural settlements. Some researchers believe that such items were passed down as part of a dowry, as a tool to restrain a wife. In the context of economic crisis and the collapse of the empire, control over women's bodies became even more stringent. Men believed that it was through the subjugation of the family that they would maintain power in the chaos. Medical texts from late antiquity, based on the works of Galen, continue to record the consequences of these practices. Women died from chronic inflammation, tuberculosis caused by breast damage, and infertility associated with constant trauma to the uterus. The average life expectancy for women was significantly lower than for men. This was not a problem for society. Demographic losses were offset by constant wars and an influx of female slaves who could be turned into wives or concubines. Social customs that had taken root in Rome were passed on to the barbarian kingdoms that inherited the imperial traditions. The Germanic tribes and the Franks adopted Roman laws on the subordination of wives to their husbands, and with them, the right to punish them. The same wording can be found in early medieval laws. The husband has the right to bring his wife to her senses, and her resistance is considered a violation of order. The Roman understanding of marriage as a form of slavery proved so strong that even the collapse of the empire did not destroy it. Christian councils discussed issues of marriage and morality, but their decisions often only reinforced the dependence of wives. In the 4th century, councils explicitly stated that a woman had no right to break the union on her own, even if her husband beat her. In the 5th century, Augustine wrote that pain and suffering in marriage should be accepted as a trial that purifies the soul. This meant that physical abuse gained a new justification. It was now interpreted as a means of spiritual education. Over time, sophisticated practices such as iron rings on the chest or public sexual punishment gradually faded into obscurity, but their logic lived on in other forms. In early medieval Europe, so-called chastity belts were widely used, which were in many ways direct descendants of Roman instruments of control. The idea remained the same: a wife's body belonged to her husband, and any resistance had to be suppressed with iron. The psychological impact of the Roman system cannot be overestimated. Generations of women lived in conditions where pain and submission were perceived as a natural part of marriage. This tradition shaped a culture of silence where women's voices were not heard. Even in the rare cases when chroniclers recorded the suffering of wives, they described it not as a crime, but as a tragic but acceptable part of life. Thus, the abuse of wives in Rome became a legacy that did not disappear with the empire. It became the foundation for European marriage traditions, where subjugation and control persisted for centuries. Behind the marble statues, laurel wreaths, and grandeur of the forums, there was always another story: the story of women turned into captives in their own homes. Their bodies were an arena for pain, their lives a chain bound in iron. And this was the true face of Roman love: slavery disguised as union, abuse legalized as the norm, and suffering that was considered natural for centuries.